And before we start with addressing the questions, I would like first to introduce Mr. Bravius Kahyoza and Mr. Charles Makakala, who joined us today to address the impact of the war in Ukraine in Tanzania, or questioning what is the impact, or whether at all there is an impact in Tanzania, and how the government has responded to the various political and diplomatic action that has been taken at the United Nations level. Mr. Bravius Kahyoza holds a PhD in economics. He's a university lecturer at the University of Kampala, at the International University of Kampala. He teaches development economy, project management, and international economics. And he's a visiting fellow at the Strathmore University in Nairobi. But he is a researcher in the field of international trade, public policy, and trade negotiation. And of course, a lot more than that, but just for the sake of time. Mr. Charles, on the other hand, is a technologist by profession. Maybe you might want to tell us what exactly that is. He holds a master's degree in telecommunication and works in management and as a business consultant. And he also writes for the Citizen in Tanzania, and he's based in Dar es Salaam. Mr. Kahyoza, Mr. Makakala, thank you for joining us today. And based on the video we just saw, and having in mind that the interviewed were not professional, but they were layperson, normal people in the street of Dar es Salaam, in the street in Tanzania, and we heard their opinion on the war in Ukraine and how the government has responded, whether it has been the best way to respond or not. Now, just give us a picture, Mr. Makakala, how relevant, how mainstream is the war in Ukraine in Tanzania? Not necessarily in your area of work, but how mainstream is it? How is it present? Is it present in the media at all?
Thank you very much, Aneth. It's my pleasure to be here. As I've said, I'm a technologist. Just to expand on that, I am an engineer by profession, specializing in telecommunication. For about 5 to 7 years, I've not been hands-on. Therefore, I've more or less moved from the technical part. I'm doing more or less the what I call the conceptual part, the planning and the designing and the management part is needed. Going back to your question, the issue has captured significant interest in Tanzania. As you have seen, from the video, almost, everyone has heard something about what is going on. There is, significant debate in the social media, especially on WhatsApp. Everyone has an opinion. From what we have seen, I would say possibly that which, has been captured more or less represent the positions of Tanzania. You can see that there are, more people speaking either on, in agreement with what, the actions that Russia has taken, or supporting what Tanzania has been doing. But there are a couple of voices that try to balance that. I would say I'm possibly one of those few who see people from a different perspective. But once again, the issue has captured significant attention.
Okay, thank you. You talked of trying to balance. What exactly do you mean by that?
There are things which I consider to be historical. These are historical trends. Tanzania used to be at the forefront of African liberation. We used to follow a leftist perspective. In other words, this is the camp that we were identified with. Therefore, the kind of thought trends which I would say, which dominate the Tanzanian intellectuals or intelligentsia, I would say still or remains to be leftist. It's anti-colonial with emphasis on the ideas of decolonization, etc., etc. Therefore, once you start to approach everything with that mindset, then everything, takes the, everything looks as a black and white thing. That means, if it's Russia, then Russia must be good. If it's the West, then the West must be in the wrong. But when you start to get into details, possibly that's when you start to see the real picture.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Charles. Mr. Bravius, is the real picture known to most of the people? The real picture we're talking of not being just white or black, and on the other side, how much is the topic political? Because it might be mainstream, but it's not political yet. It's not a political discussion in the country. Because, for instance, we've seen here in Germany how political the discussion has been in relation to the war in Ukraine. How political is it? And how much information is there that it's not just black and white, if at all it's not black and white?
Thank you, Aneth. Once again, I'm profoundly honored, exceedingly humbled to be here with you, and most importantly, to discuss the subject matter with my friend Charles. I would approach your question in three fronts. Number one, it is very clear. I think we insist on the first argument that was marshaled by Charles on the conservatism nature of the Tanzanians. I think being underlined in the political ideologies that Tanzania for so long throughout, I think it has been leaning, no, of course, listening from the political, yes. So you have two conflicting perspectives. One is that the leaders are trying to maintain the neutrality stance, but technically you'd find that they are leaning to what I call the emerging East, or the new emerging East, the Chinese and the group. And in this war, it has not been different. And if you're listening carefully to the people, you find that conservatism nature of these of the Tanzanians. Number two, I think we don't have enough information in the public. Speaking of the trust, there is not enough information out there. What is very clear is that there is information asymmetry according to the group you are talking with or you are trying to probe. For example, the past few months, I've been talking to experts, politicians and journalists. It's very, very clear that the magnitude and depth of this war in terms of information is a bit scanty in the nation. But I think one group which is very clear about what is happening between Ukraine and Russia and the impact to the globe and Africa, I think it's only the people from the academia, particularly researchers in international relations, and the public intellectuals. Whether it has become an issue in terms of debates politically or not, I think that is not very important. The most important thing is to what extent had this war affected Tanzania? One, economically, and number two, politically, because we have seen some of the political reorientations in the past few months being instigated by what is happening in Europe between Russia and Ukraine, particularly when we talked about the energy sector. And we have seen that. In fact, even the government, there's a way in which we have seen some fractures in the coming out of the consequences. Lastly, what we're trying to portray as intellectuals, that yes, it's a good thing. It's better Tanzania to be neutral. and therefore giving the government that leeway to stand with that position. But in an actual sense, that is not the correct position, because the government is on one side saying, insisting that they take an approach of being in the support, as we have been, on the support of defensive violence. That's what they have been saying throughout history. That's what they talk in political rally, in political platforms. They don't act on the defensive violence in Ukraine. They say we are neutral, but in a way, you see a line in which they are heading towards oppressive violence. And I think this has, I think, unleashed a number of questions on the critical path analysis of our modern diplomacy. This is what I would have to state.
Mr. Bravius, so to get you right, you do, I think that also applies to Mr. Makakala. You all both agree that the effects of the war has not only been economically, but also politically as well. And that the fact that it's not a political debate, but it's still mainstreamed with less information that help, I would say, the normal people in the country, let alone those into politics and those who have more access to information, that to make a conclusion that might be right in that particular sense. But we also mentioned the political or the portray that the Tanzanian government makes of itself by not siding with Ukraine or Russia, that also comes, or that implies more of a support of, not of Ukraine, but rather Russia, the international arena. And that's maybe, Mr. Charles, what's your opinion on that? Because we have seen the General Assembly passing resolution condemning the war in Ukraine, the war, the acts of aggression that Russia has done in Ukraine, that also had condemned the annexation of part of Ukraine by Russia. And Tanzania has not decided to vote against nor for, but has rather abstained from voting. What is that? What being neutral means?
Well, my position is quite clear on that. And as you might be aware, I actually published an article. I'm in that position because I felt that it was a position that needed to be articulated. Everybody was silent. We are probably used to taking the so-called non-aligned position, but in this particular case, I questioned what neutrality means. What does it mean to be non-aligned? As you said, I feel that we are only hiding behind the non-alignment position. What we're actually saying is that we are supporting Russia. Because what does it mean to be non-aligned in this? If there is a nation that has been attacked with a much, stronger neighbor, with the intention of more or less annexing parts of its territories, you cannot claim non-alignment because these are not equal powers. On one side, you have a nation that that's very strong. It can more or less do anything that it wants. When you say that you are non-aligned, what you are saying is that you are supporting the other part. There is another argument here because many people tend to consider this as a West versus Russia issue. I think that also misses the point. Yes, there are arguments which can be raised saying that, okay, there are dynamics which may lead to that. But actually, when you remove everything else, it comes down to a few principles. That there is a right for self-determination, there is a right for territorial integrity, independence, etc., etc. And these are the principles which govern the non-alignment movement. Therefore, for Tanzania not to support, outrightly support Ukraine, the way I see it is that it is actually supporting Russia. It simply, doesn't want to come out into the open and say that we are supporting Russia.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Bravius, do you share the same opinion? Do you see that there are certain situations where government, in particular the Tanzanian government, cannot claim the principle of non-alignment, but has to explicitly stand with the party that the government itself thinks has the right to, to protect, or let's say in this case, to aggress another neighboring country?
It isn't that easy if you are to look at the dynamics within the nation in terms of the domestic policy vis-a-vis the extension of that domestic policy of what we call the international policy. There were two main arguments, Aneth. Number one is what the current administration is doing. At least let's talk for now, what the current administration is doing and what is facing. When the new president came into power, he came up with what she has named as the 4 R's. So she has insisted on reconciliation, because we know where what we went through in the last 5 years, resilience, reforms, and rebuilding. Now, in that lines, the president actually and her government are not aiming at attaining these 4 R's through the domestic mechanisms. They're depending on the outside or the outside lines to achieve. Now, much of what she needs, or the country needs, cannot come from one side, say the West, or from the East. And for obvious reasons, if we get time, we'll go into that. So she cannot, or they cannot do that. What we know clearly is that is a caveat. That's what they portray, at least. But we know deep down, it's a different trajectory. They are leaning to the imaging. The second point is
Mr. Bravius, just to intervene there. So, if I'm understanding you right, you're trying to build an argument that states that for the sake of the interest of the country, best interest of the country, it's better for Tanzania, as they did, to abstain from voting pro or contra the resolutions, right?
Of course, at the apex of the government's agenda is to recalibrate the ailing economy. If you are to look seriously, I think in the last few years, our economy has been internally limping in both micro and macroeconomic variables. And that has been coupled with the constipating exogenous factors from outside the economy in terms of the ways the government has been dealing with the rest of the world. So there is a sense in which one can say that the government is trying to bring some sanity in terms of the two angles of the economy. Hence, the way it has decided to handle the Ukraine issue at the United Nations. Of course, going forward, I think we'll have to relook at the strategy, because it is more of a short-termism perspective, and that is not a very good way to go.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Bravius. Mr. Charles, those goodies that the government might be afraid of losing if they side with Ukraine or with Russia, I mean, how are they at risk?
Well, you're asking the wrong person, because I actually, don't feel that Russia has much to offer, not only Tanzania, but Africa, apart from trouble. Well, what is the first, product that Russia, sells to Africa? Is weapons. I would say about, 50% of all weapons that are sold to Africa come from Russia. And this is what Russia is known. If the only product that, I would say is you're mostly competent in is applying weapons, and weapons to some weird nations. We are talking of, nations like Central African Republic and the like. I would want to keep, mentioning all of them, Eritrea, etc., etc. Russia is positioning itself wrongly. And as a nation, I know that Tanzania has been connected to Russia for a long time, from the very beginning. And we have had defense and security relationships from those, very early days. Russia supported many Tanzanians to go to study in Russia, supported, it helped build our army. And for many years, it had people on the ground supporting and providing technical support, etc., etc. That still continues today, although the impact has reduced, but we still rely on Russia for that. Those are some of the, I would say, the goodies that we get from Russia. But apart from that, Russia, I would say, provides moral support for nations which do not want to behave, nations which do, will not want their people to be free. Therefore, Russia is a model for that. Consider the nations that tend to vote with Russia in these matters. You will be, you do not want to be in their company, the likes of North Korea, Zimbabwe, etc., etc., Syria. These are rogue nations. Possibly even, failed nations. There is a reason that those are Russia's friends. Therefore,
now
does Tanzania
in your opinion, Mr. Chaz, if you're saying there are reasons why those countries do side with Russia, now, what is the biggest reason that makes Tanzania, at least impliedly, in your opinion, side with Russia?
There are a number of reasons that can be mentioned. Number one, I would say this is the historical, but it's not, reason that I consider to be important, that non-aligned movement position. It's historical in the sense that this is what we used to do in an issue that involved the West versus Russia or USSR in those days. Would have voted, would have abstained from taking a side. Therefore, this is the first position. Number two, as I've said, is the security and defense consideration. Number three, and I would say this is, it can, it's usually not spoken, but I would say it's possibly always in the background. It's the existing undercurrent of what I can say anti-West or anti-American position. It's always there. It is subtle. It comes in, it manifests itself in different forms. It's not like, we hate Americans. That's not the point. It's an intellectual position. It's an ideology. Let me put it like that. It's an ideology. We have not moved from the early days of the colonial, anti-colonial struggles. Therefore, the same tone is still there.
Yes.
That affects the way we look at things. There is also what we call what you can say, historical connections. If you've had thousands of people going to Russia to study, and my father is, one of them, he spent 7 years in USSR. There is that cultural connection between the two societies.
Yeah.
Russia used to supply books. Even when I was a little boy, I used to read books from Russia. These were applied for free.
Mm.
Ultimately, you are going to have that cultural connection between the two. We look at Russia, or many Tanzanians will tend to look at Russia as a big brother, as a nation that presents
So,
our position.
Mm-hmm. So, Mr. Chair, just to put that into a few sentences, you're saying there are, I would say, 4 reasons why Tanzania impliedly is siding with Russia. One being the historical non-aligned principle that has been there, and Tanzania has been trying to not align with certain countries or specific countries at the United Nations level. But we're talking of security and defense, the support we've been getting, but the idea of being anti-West, with political reason into consideration. But we also mention of this cultural extent that is far-reaching, even in the days of early independence of Tanzania, where we had people going to Russia and vis-a-vis vice versa for studies, for instance. But Mr. Bravius, you mentioned the impacts of the war being both politically and economically. But then we have now the big brother, the big boss, the big sister at the international arena, the UN, that is supposed to be a community of countries discussing issues that do affect not only single countries or 2 countries, but rather the entire world, all continents. And then we have Tanzania abstaining, but we also have been hearing of challenges, of the weakness that the United Nations has been facing, that the system doesn't work, mostly from scholars, but also from African countries. Is that also a way of saying we do not agree with the structure that is there, we want it to be reformed? And if that's the case, Mr. Kahyoza, what reforms are necessary?
Yes, I do personally believe that the call for democratic and institutional reforms to the United Nations is solidly grounded. And I do believe so because something that has worked for the better needs to be protected, not by preserving the elements that are not very helpful, but by making sure that you get rid of ill traits that are coming in to destroy that thing, in this case, an institution. So I believe that people who are calling for these reforms, many are of that view that this is an institution which has been noble and we need to protect it by making sure that it is not intruded by harmful traits. But we must say it very clearly and very strongly that the United Nations has done a lot of good things to the South and to Africans in particular. Following the establishment of the United Nations, we remember the adoption of the Charter in 1945. Various people in Africa gained awareness in their fundamental rights, and they were felt, of course, empowered in the struggle for self-determination. And one has to go and look and check and recheck Article 73 of the Charter that gave three important issues. Number one, it called for self-government, which Africans were crying for. Number two, it gave the progressive development of the free political institutions. Number three, it gave those two in accordance to the circumstances of each territory and its people. And therefore, these were very important as they gave Africans new hope to be the masters of their own future. Now, the future never ends. This is where we are. Despite the fact that the platforms like the United Nations and like the General Assembly, which gave the forum in which Africa's political aspirations could find voice and support, it is very important to note that post-colonial era, many challenges emerged. Many states lacked strong democratic institutions, and it became the theater of civil conflicts whereby rival ethnic, religious, and other groups fought for access of power and resources. Now, in that struggle, new forces came in, not only from within Africa, but also from outside Africa. And those within Africa related very well with those forces, ill-intended forces from outside. Hence, the destruction of the fabric of the original state of Africa. And many people now started asking, where is the UN? Yes, it has played its role in some parts, but people are saying, no, it has not done it enough. Not because of lack of resources as one aspect that has been fronted, but also because of this skewedness in a way the United Nations views the world. So they're saying we need an helicopter view as to that effect if the United Nations has to keep on doing what it was intended to be doing. And I think that is the most important thing. Of course, there are people within Africa who are using that call as a red herring, of course, to protect their interests, politics of preservation because of dictatorial tendencies. On one side, they argue that we don't need democratic centralism from the United Nations and the globe of the world, that we want to build civilizational states, but within those states, they run some undemocratic principles in the way they run their states. Hence, a lot of problems that are not ending in themselves within those nations, but they have some ripple effects to the neighboring countries and to the globe as well. And with that, of course, we have to be very careful and to make sure that as much as we demand for democratic and institutional reforms, we have to be careful not to belittle the importance that the United Nations keeps on playing in Africa and to the world. But I must add, when I talked about the goodies from the East, I meant the philosophical and economic side of it. You know, for the last 30, 40 years, the world has been singing that let's globalize economics and let's liberalize politics. Now, in so doing, of course, we have seen some negative effects, many being, of course, the economic. And then some people are saying, okay, how do we preserve the interests of Africa in this state of affairs? So one flawed argument within that is that, you know, we need to lean to the emerging East. And the emerging East, and why do they call for the emerging East? Because they think that models like the Putinist model are not confrontational to the state of affairs in Africa when leaders actually are benefiting from those grounds. And to any leader or administrator who is eyeing that kind of leadership, the best good, the most important good, I mean, is to preserve power is to have someone who can help him or her keep power without interfering, and the rest can follow. And this is what the Putinist model gives to African leaders. And economically speaking, you may say that even when these people don't intend to go with undemocratic principles within their countries, but they think they will be safe if they are to rely on the other side.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Kahyoza. Mr. Charles, I mean, responding to what Mr. Kahyoza said, but also looking at the argument that Mr. Patrick, considering the political background or the tie that Tanzania has with Russia, but also other countries of the former Soviet Union. And if you were to translate the abstaining to the UN resolution as being neutral, is that a sign, or are there chances that countries abstaining, including Tanzania, could play a mediator role as the negotiator to bring to peace the war in Ukraine?
I understand that that's the position that a number of nations have tried to take. For example, South Africa and Kenya. Some of you might be aware of the speech that Dr. Martin Kimani, the Kenyan representative to ambassador in the United Nations, he made a what is now considered, a very popular or famous speech at the beginning of the war, condemning the war and making very cogent arguments against the invasion. But when it came, that was before the vote was taken. That was at the end of, February. But when the vote was taken, amazingly, Kenya abstained. Similarly, with South Africa, they also abstained from that particular vote. And when the government was taken to task, because there was an uproar, especially in social media. They wanted to know why the government made the decision that it did. And the government explained that the way the resolution was drafted, it did not address their concerns. In other words, it wasn't constructive enough. It didn't provide the solution that it did. What this means is that these nations, they wanted to see a resolution that provided, not only condemned, or possibly they wanted to avoid the condemnation part, but they wanted to take the discussions further towards the solution. And they felt that because their concerns were not addressed in terms of what was actually written in the resolution, then they abstained. I'm not sure whether that is justified or not, but I feel that given the so-called neutrality position, yes, Africa, either through EU or a number of African nations, possibly led with the likes of South Africa, Nigeria, etc., can indeed take a leadership role, because they are not considered necessary to take one side or the other. Although traditionally, I would say the likes of South Africa, it also has very strong historical connections with Russia. Its ANC was supported by Russia, especially at the later part of their struggle. But I believe that African nations can lead, at least start the negotiations and take them to a point where there might be some fruitful results.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Charles, for responding to that. Dear listeners, you're also invited to send questions via the chat. Please do so. We still have a few minutes left with Mr. Makakala and Mr. Kahyoza, and as you can hear, the expert, and would, I think, be pleased to answer some of your questions. Yes, So, I mean, well, saying that it's a matter of that certain countries, including South Africa and Kenya, just abstained from voting for the resolution based on matter of technicalities, on languages. Is that not also, I would say, an argument that is not valid, but rather than trying to find other reasons for not voting for something? And I mean, did they explicitly say what content that the resolution missed, that in case that if it would have been involved or included, they would have voted pro the resolution, Mr. Charles?
In the case of South Africa, they actually said what they wanted. I don't remember exactly what the minister said, but in the case of Kenya, this was quite baffling, because one would have expected that after such a rousing and very interesting speech, I would, actually, urge all the listeners to go and listen to that speech. It's actually quite interesting. It presents many of the arguments that I would say I believe in, that this is the right position for us as African nations to take. But you would have expected that based on that foundation, Kenya would have gone forward to actually vote against Russia, vote with others in condemnation of Russia. But when it came to taking the actions, they didn't. And this is where you can see the struggle that African nations have when it comes to these matters. Russia has been trying to woo Africa since 2014, after the first Ukrainian war, when it annexed Crimea. Russia has gone into the offensive, the diplomatic offensive, in trying to balance the losses that it made from the sanctions that the West put against it. And Africa presented an opportunity. This is the time that Russia decided to do the first Russia-Africa summit. I think it was done in 2019. And many leaders have been quoted to Moscow and vice versa. It has been quite powerful. And as a result, I would say many nations are possibly struggling to outrightly come and condemn Russia.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Makakala. Now, I mean, just to wrap it all up, just one sentence from each of you, because there have been arguments that the reason that many African countries didn't vote for the resolution is a sign of calling for a democratization of the UN, including all the organs, the Security Council, and where African countries are not presented. How do you respond to that in one sentence, each of you, Mr. Kahyoza, being the first one to respond?
As I said before, there are genuine reasons for the democratization, for the restructuring of the United Nations. That goes without saying. But in this case, it wasn't the case. What African countries, most of them at least, did was what you'd call, what lawyers say, that if you don't have the facts, hammer the law. If you don't have the law, hammer the table. This is what they did. Actually, everything else was hot air, and there was nothing about the democracy. That is not fit, the fact that the UN restructured.
Thank you. Thank you for keeping your sentence very short. Mr. Charles Makakala.
Thank you. I believe that we all agree that the United Nations need to be reformed. It's the nature of those reforms which is a bit tricky, because if we are talking of balancing, giving Russia, a powerful nation, a fair chance with Moldova or Ukraine, or you have the United States on one side, you wanted to have equal voice with Burundi, etc., etc. You can see the dilemma that it's quite unlikely that we are going to have that kind of a United Nations. These nations will continue to dominate the United Nations, and there is nothing that the rest of the world can do about it. Yeah. All that I can say is that I'm wishing for a United Nations that will at least be able to address some of the critical issues that humanity face when it comes to the likes of climate change, interventions, let's say in places like, now we have DRC, but a good example is the genocide in Rwanda. At least we can address those things. But I do not see a future where United States will have, say, with Burundi or Botswana. That will not happen. We have to be practical. We have to accept that this is the world that we live in.
Thank you very much. So, I mean, just to wrap it up again, so I had a feeling that you have similar opinions, which I think I'm allowed to say also that I share. And we see that Tanzania abstaining from voting for the resolution, it has to do with the political ties, economic ties that it has with Russia, but also keeping in mind what effects it might have on Tanzania economically and politically if they would have voted for or against the resolution of the United Nations. Tanzania and the war in Ukraine, it is mainstream to a lot of people that do not have as access to detailed and analytical information. Of course, it's black and white, but for those who I think participated today in this NetTalk, I think have a deeper picture now based on the expertise that we heard from Mr. Makakala and Mr. Kahyoza. We do thank you very much for joining us today, taking your time after a long workday